you see the little recording at the top?
No, but it
Um,
might be because I have my PowerPoint open.
oh, yep. Okay. Yep. You're good. I'm going to mute myself again, and then you can just get started, and I'll just cut out these first few seconds.
Okay, great.
All right.
Ready?
Hang on one second. There we
Okay.
go. All right. Yep. You're good.
All right. So hello, this is Clifford Quinn. Welcome to the Maryland real estate contract from the perspective of us, the mortgage banking community. What you're going to, just my background very quickly, as you can see down by the bottom with the little initials past my name, I actually am an attorney. I got my law degree from George Mason University School of Law. And I also have an MBA from George Washington University. Interestingly enough, very quickly on my background, I actually got into mortgage banking in 1985 when I was in my last year of law school. So I kind of, anybody out there who's as ancient as me can remember that was the first big, huge refi boom. And I thought, well, I'll do mortgage banking. That seemed like kind of a low intensity, give me a little free time to study for the bar exam, which I'm happy to say I was actually able to pass. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through very relatively quickly the continuing education class that I teach to the Maryland Realtors on their contract. But what I want to do is those points that I emphasize for them to be sure they do right are points that we should be aware of and look for to be sure they're done right. This is actually a 3-hour CE, but take a deep breath. I'm actually condensing this into about 15 minutes. So I'm going to scroll quickly through some parts that are not as relevant to us and get right into the contract itself. So typically what I do is I go through this whole history lesson. I teach them what time of the essence is, specific performance, et cetera, et cetera. But what I want to do is, I love suits. I don't know if anybody out there picks up that reference. I do go through the whole history of common law and where the terms for real property contracts come from. Trying to turn them into legal historians. What's important is to understand, what does it take to create a contract? Offer, acceptance, consideration, the mutual intent to be bound, which is called the meeting of the minds. And how that relates to us is that a contract is not fully ratified until the parties have agreed to all the terms. And where we become impacted on our end is the contract comes in, we start the loan application process. I know you've all been there. And then the parties start fighting with each other over the impact of a home inspection and repairs, and the appraisal comes back and there's FHA or lender required repairs. And how does that impact us as we negotiate the process for them? Again, just very quickly going, these are the legal terms that I teach them, but really emphasizing how important it is that a contract's not fully ratified, fully in play until the parties agree to all the terms. And once again, where we can get hung up in the process is, especially in today's market where we've got, our own time delays due to backup, is that the parties don't come to agreement on repairs, et cetera, and it drags on and it impacts underwriting. And you as a loan officer really need to help manage that process. Again, so I go through what a real estate contract is for them. My information will be available. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to show you and share this presentation with you. Another piece that's incredibly important is that all aspects of the real estate contract must be in writing and must be signed. And we need to pay attention to that, particularly in this day and age where we're all using electronic signatures and we're moving documents electronically. You have to really you really do have to scan the real estate contract to ensure that some realtor didn't forget to drop that, initial box or that signature box on an incredibly relevant term or paragraph or addendum. I'm going to get into a couple that I have personally been involved with where the parties either forgot they signed a particular addendum, or mistakenly signed it or mistakenly didn't sign it. Once again, time is of the essence, and that's incredibly important to us is because there are very specific time frames that realtors must meet. And of course, the one that's we drive is the financing, securing financing, the time periods within which realtors must bring their buyer to you and secure financing for you to write the pre-approval letter, etc. I'm sure many of you seen this where a realtor has executed a contract. And again, time is of the essence means the buyers and sellers must meet specific time frames. And if they've got 5 days or 7 days that they're supposed to make loan app and secure the pre-approval letter, and they don't do that, or they wait till day 6 and they start calling you up, it falls upon us to be sure that we help meet that time frame. Here's with regard to specific performance. This just gets into the courts will require the parties to perform, once again, per the contract terms and as it impacts us specifically date considerations. You have to watch out for this whole debate over personalty, realty, and fixtures. And basically, I'm sure many of you have seen this one where they go under contract and we're doing the loan app, and then, oops, the seller decided that they were going to take the chandelier out and the parties get into beef, and it's, is a chandelier a fixture? And basically the bottom line is that absent a contract term excluding an item, if it's physically attached to the property, it's a fixture, it conveys. And again, this is something you're in the middle of the loan process and the parties start beefing on it, and it's incumbent upon us to help guide the agents, our client, the buyer through this process to ensure that we get done in a timely manner. So going on. So let's look at the standard Maryland contract. Again, it's got to be in writing. It has to identify all the parties, the seller and buyer. You'll be stunned at times that they don't do that. Identify the real estate purchase price, all the signatures. And then again, as I discussed, the meeting of the minds, etc. These are very, beyond the scope of our discussion. Here's the actual contract itself. Terms of sections that you want to be sure you see completed, I've enumerated here. Identify all the parties, actually describe the real estate address, the dollar amount, what the earnest money deposit is, the date of settlement, and then as you can see at the bottom, here are all the different financing addendums that, depending upon the type of loan that the borrower is attempting to secure, to ensure that the agents accurately use and complete the appropriate financing addendum. As it pertains, once again, to us, I see this a lot in pre-approval letters or pre-qual letters from our side is, I encourage you that if you're doing FHA, you're doing VA, you do USDA, that in your letter, you specifically identify interest rate, term, type of loan, base loan amount as appropriate, and then as appropriate, the funding fee, the MIP, the USDA guarantee fee, so that the agents can accurately complete the various financing addendums. Here again, it's the financing clause. Check this out to be sure that the parties, the buyers, have gotten to you and you're able to respond with your analysis, your pre-approval, your pre-qualification, ultimately perhaps your loan commitment within time to meet this clause. This is a drop dead date for a contract. Here's the conventional loan financing addendum. Each of the addendums are different. Another area that we've got to be very, very conscious of, particularly, is how the parties handle required repairs, particularly in an environment which is typical when you're dealing with first-time home buyers. Specifically, is you're going to see, sellers giving closing cost consideration is, if you get into a situation where there have been identified repairs, you can be very careful how the parties draft the addendums to deal with those costs. If, for example, you're doing a conventional loan and they've already agreed to the 3% maximum seller contribution, and oh, boom, here comes a seller repair that's 5 or 10 grand, or a lender required repair rather, 5 or 10 grand, and it's guiding the agents into accurately writing an addendum that does not turn that dollar amount into additional closing costs. And then you go above the 3% limit for conventional, or you go above the 6% limit for FHA. And now we have an we have a loan approval issue, and the parties now have an issue because the buyer thinks they're going to get a certain sum of money and now they're not. And they begin to, all the back and forth starts. What I encourage you to do is, if you get in, you also have to be very careful with required repairs as to how the agent writes that addendum. Typically what I recommend is to try and wrap it into closing costs where the parties are not identifying specific repairs, because then what that will require us to do in the underwrite process is send an appraiser out and verify that repairs have been completed. Oftentimes the parties want to try and put money in escrow or pay for it because there's not enough time within the contract period to address the repairs. You want to be very, very careful, very cautious, and pay attention to those types of things. There is another issue that you should look for is anytime a borrower selects a loan product, particularly conventional, less so on the government side, where, they don't qualify because they're self-employed and they wrote everything off, but didn't tell you that until you start collecting all their documents, is that the financing addendums provide the opportunity for the buyer to secure alternative financing, but it can never result in an increase in cost to the seller. Here's FHA's addendum. Once again, I cannot emphasize enough. Be sure that the amendatory clause is executed, signed, initialed, and again, pay attention to, as you can see under loan details, provide them the agents the base loan amount, the mortgage insurance premium, and the total loan amount, and the interest rate, loan term. Because if you don't, guaranteed you're going to run into agents who do not know how to execute these addendums correctly. Then you get an underwrite issue and you're into back and forth, which none of us needs. You get into, once again, here's the lender required repair piece. This can become a bone of contention between buyers and sellers. There's obviously more flexibility, more space to move within FHA before, and VA and even USDA before you bump up against the maximum seller contribution, but you need to be aware of this. I always try and make it a point that when you've got a property and you take a look at it, at that MLS, those MLS photos, and you're going to get mandated repairs, that you advise your buyer and their agent about the impact of that. Here's VAs, again, very similar to the FHA financing addendum. The big one here being, once again, paying attention to the lender required repairs. The veteran is not expected or required to make those payments. Once again, USDA, I highlighted, it has its own amendatory clause. So what you have on the amendatory clause is FHA, VA, USDA. If the property does not appraise, the client has an absolute right to walk from the contract without penalty. And I'm sure many of you are out there, you're going to find that there's not more than a couple of agents who don't understand this, and that you're going to have to explain this to them. Let's see what else. Here's the alternate financing clause again. I told you there is always an option for the buyer to pursue alternative financing. You get them into a non-QM product, but it cannot cost the seller more money. Watch for the home inspection clause. This is the one where they run out. You've got the loan in process. This typically impacts negotiations on sales price and closing cost, and the parties will get into it over who's got to pay for what repair. Manage this process. You don't want to get hung up in a situation where, once again, an agent's written an addendum and the closing cost, the repair costs are now being called a closing cost, and oh, oops, you bumped up above the 3% limit. The other one on a conventional loan, the other issue that you want to pay attention to is explaining to agents that, yeah, you wrote on that FHA deal 3% of the closing cost. And as you know, sometimes that dollar amount can in fact exceed the closing cost. And then the buyer thinks, and then you don't use up the entirety of the closing cost offer by the seller, and the buyer feels like they're being cheated. It's really important to understand this, explain this to the parties that even though there's that maximum dollar amount, in fact, the buyer's not getting something that for nothing or something free, that in fact you've covered all the legal closing costs. Once again, this is a situation where you may have to explain to the agent, here are the valid closing costs here are the costs that are in fact closing costs, as opposed to, you can never roll our fees into the closing cost addendum. Here's a property inspection. Take a look at this one. What you're looking for is to be sure that these paragraphs have been initialed and signed. I cannot tell you, I'm sure you've seen it. Agents use .lib, they use DocuSign, and sure enough, somebody forgets to drop an initial or a signature field. You really want to watch for that. Inclusion and exclusions. It's kind of an overlay for us, but this is the addendum that the parties can use to, as I was telling you, identify, here are the items that are going to convey, here are items that are not going to convey. It is relevant to us to recognize contract addendums and see that they're there. One that you may very well start bumping into, I certainly have lately, is when you get into leased items, particularly solar panels. And if you see that in the transaction, do your research on the lease agreement. It's not insignificant to secure that information. You get into condition disclosures. Once again, this is more, be sure you kind of take a look at these items and these contracts so that you see that the property, that this has all been completed and executed. No one's looking for you to comment on it, and never ever provide any kind of legal analysis. That's not good. There are, depending upon the jurisdiction you're in, you're doing business on the Eastern Shore, you're doing business in the greater capital area, there are many jurisdiction-specific addendums. Pay attention if they're in your contract. Again, this is kind of a scan thing for us, but if they're there, you want to be aware of them, because these clauses can dramatically impact your transaction. Lead poisoning, another one. You're doing business in somewhere inner city, Baltimore City. This is another biggie. Be sure the parties have executed the appropriate disclosures, and if they've got to do remedial work, that it's done properly, because it will hang up your loan. Watch for this one: deferred water and sewer, front foot benefit fees. Check the property. Be sure you're aware of if the property involved in your transaction has this as a component. The failure of the seller to disclose deferred water and sewer front foot benefit fee under Maryland law is significant, as are the penalties. It could be a deal killer. I encourage you, I always do this, I pull the multiple listing to look to be sure whether or not there are these types of charges. Any of you do business, again, North Anne Arundel County, Baltimore City, when you get into the lease ground rents, really watch those. That's another one that agents sometimes miss. and can really get us hung up. You all know, I'm sure everybody out there knows about the termite clause. Once again, this is one you get agents are going to come up to you and go, well, will FHA require termite? Well, no, but maybe you're going to, you coach your buyer. Certainly VA does. Who has to pay for it? Who has to make the repairs? Agents can get lost on this. I encourage you to be aware and be able to explain. I won't get into the earnest money deposit piece there. This has become heavily legislated of late, and that's not an issue that we need to deal with other than tracking down, if you wrote an EMD, did it get deposited? Show me that the check cleared. Title, broom clean, again, these aren't issues that we necessarily need to deal with. Watch out for HOA, that's another one, deferred charges from for benefit fees that the agents have appropriately made the adjustments. I want to get into, I hope you're scan reading this very quickly. And I'm sure you all know you get the HOA. It is incumbent upon the agents to be sure that they deliver, you get the HOA package to the buyers. Oftentimes that's going to fall on you. You got to help that process along. The buyer always has an absolute right to review that document and walk from the contract. There is a specific addendum to that. Ground rent, I told you about that one. We don't need to worry so much about contingencies or leases or default. That doesn't impact us on our end. We hope they don't default after we go through the entire process of getting title and running all their documents down. I know you guys all know that one. On our end, and it is incumbent upon the buyer and seller, this is one of their authorizations actually buried in the contract that gives us the authority to disclose TILA and RESPA as required by federal law. Property insurance, flood insurance, again, these are issues that we are not necessarily involved in, but it's always important to pay attention to these to help. Another big one you want to watch out for if you're doing business, this comes up in the district a lot, is if you have a foreign national seller, there is a dramatic tax implication on the buyer if in fact they being the parties to the contract, do not make appropriate make the process work such that the IRS taxes against the foreign national, it's called FIRFA, F-I-R-F-A, are withheld, because if they are not, it'll fall on the buyer. I have seen major transactions in the district where it didn't happen, and a buyer gets stuck with like a 5-figure bill. You want to watch out for that one. IRS, wetlands. Again, here's an example of various clauses that, depending upon where you are, must be executed. Just reiterating, here's the FIRFA on the IRS. We don't need to worry about these other representations and clauses. Moving along. Oh, computation of days. It's relevant for us because this will come up again. Remember, I'm talking about the financing addendum on how days are calculated, not to be confused with everything we got to do under Dodd-Frank, but what they use are their clock always starts the next day after signing a contract or an addendum. It counts every day except, and it only counts business days, so it doesn't count weekends, nor does it count holidays. All right. Here's a biggie. The first-time home buyer clause. Pay attention. If our buyer is a first-time home buyer, Maryland law by default says that the seller will pay all transfer and recordation. And it is stunning to me how often agents don't realize this. Then they don't execute this particular addendum, which I'll show you kicks in and gives the parties that will ultimately have the right to negotiate dividing those costs. Okay, so to reiterate, and this came up one time, there was a first-time home buyer, and sure enough, his mom, who was a long-time legal secretary, got all upset when she saw the closing disclosure because, the transfer and recordation clauses, taxes were being divided. And she pulled out the Maryland statute that said, well, no, if you're a first-time home buyer, the seller pays all of them. And I had to pull the contract showing her where, in fact, her son had initialed first-time home buyer, initialed the first-time home buyer clause in the contract that agreed that, notwithstanding what Maryland state law says, that the parties were going to divide those costs. Standard clauses, this is where you see a lot of these different types of processes that the buyers and the agents need to go through. I'm not saying you need to know this information, but just be aware when you look at it. Here's the first-time home buyer addendum that allows for the parties to divide the transfer costs. Look for this one if you've got a home buyer, first-time home buyer. If they don't execute this, again, like the story I told you, it can be a problem. Here's different. This is an example. Once again, if depending upon a jurisdiction, this is obviously the Eastern Shore, where you have these addendum that have to do with seafood and the right to farm. You get in one of the ones I love is, and I don't know why this is, but Greater Capital Area has addendums that have to do with soil quality in the district. So all that being said, the rest of this, and again, latent material defects, just kind of understanding these terms exist. And let me see if there's any other points I'd like you to be aware of. Yeah, property conditions, one, pay attention when the parties, again, start dragging things out because they're fighting over lender required repairs or FHA or VA required repairs, that you're able to negotiate and assist because you will get involved. Final point to be aware of, once again, Maryland law, real estate transactions are as is, meaning that the buyer assumes all responsibility for a property's condition or repairs. Our caveat is be very careful how those addendums for repairs are written, that they do not adversely impact the maximum seller contributions per the loan product in play. All that being said, nobody's live, so you don't get to ask me any questions, but my contact information will be available. Please feel free to reach out. There have been broad changes made in the Maryland contract effective yesterday. I actually had those contract addendums in this presentation. They do not necessarily impact us, but what they will do is sadly, if you get a part-time agent or someone who doesn't do a lot of businesses, they may not be up to speed on these addendum. They can delay your process, our process, and you know the deal. If you've got to start extending a lock and it's costing somebody money and that's like, it's all your fault, I encourage you to email me, get a copy of this so that you just, not that you read these and know these to death, but that you recognize that they're there and that they're in the contract. That being said, that's all for right now. I hope this was helpful. Please feel free at any time via MMBBA to reach out if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to help you out. That's it. Take care. Bye-bye.